serve as the intermediary and conversationalist for this conversation. Uh, Mr. McFarlane, of course, it's a great honor for me to speak with you. And Tim, of course, I'm always honored to be in conversation with you about your work. We're here in celebration of Tim's groundbreaking adaptation of W.E.B. Du Bois's short story, The Comet, one of the precursor stories of Afrofuturism, a term that Tim is used frequently, and I really appreciate. Speaking to the fact that this is an earlier version, an early story, and what we understand to be the Afrofuturist canon that is defined primarily by works of the 20th century, but post-war. Think of Samuel Delany and his great work. Think of Octavia Butler and her ground sort of futuristic work, Charles Saunders and his work, and people like Stephen Barnes, and so many others. Today, we live in a renaissance when it comes to the question of Afrofuturism and the speculative work, with so many authors contributing to that conversation. But we would be remiss to forget the groundbreaking work of W.E.B. Du Bois. And Tim is embarking on a very definitional effort to provide a graphic adaptation of The Comet. And of course, he did so with the blessing of Mr. McFarlane. And I think it's important to recognize that while the Comet is in the public domain, his efforts to reach out and connect with the family really speaks a lot to his desire to be engaged with the family and recognize the legacy represented by this work. Tim, you
Uh,
have something you want to say?
yes, yes. For clarity, because I don't think it was mentioned, Arthur McFarlane, please raise your hand, sir. Second, please raise your hands. This gentleman is the great grandson of W.E.B. Du Bois.
Right. Yes. I was going to say that if I hadn't said it already. But yes, Arthur McFarlane is the great grandson of W.E.B. Du Bois, which is why Tim had to go to the trouble, or why it was so important for Tim to connect with him. And so we're going to have a conversation about the project and get Mr. McFarlane's. Can I call you Arthur?
Please
Is that okay?
do.
Yeah,
Please do.
and get Arthur's take on these things. So my first question is for Arthur, and it might be a silly question, but I think it's an important one to think about. And I preface this by saying, I'm here as we record this in Florida at the Zora Neale Festival of the Arts and Humanities, and this is a festival in celebration of Zora Neale, a contemporary to
Right.
W.E.B. Du Bois, and someone I personally think of as sort of on par with Du Bois in a way, in the sense that she was also someone very committed to, across a number of fields in the endeavor, celebrating Black people, celebrating their contribution to Black culture, really celebrating what they stood for. And we have some of the descendants sometimes interact with us when we're doing this festival, and we're always like very excited because we get to ask them, like, what was the person like, right? And so my question for you is, you're the great great grandson. What was it like growing up as an offspring of what many people would argue is perhaps the greatest Black intellectual of the 20th century?
It's a great question, and as you might imagine, it's a question I get asked fairly often when I do talks. I do talks, by the way, on my great grandfather all around the world. I've given talks remotely in Germany most recently, but I went to Ghana and did some talks there. So I've done a lot of work around grandpa, and that's what I call him too, by the way. Is he is technically my mother's grandfather. He's my great grandfather on my mother's side, but I call him grandpa because he's really one of the only grandfathers that I knew, that I came to understand. And because of all the work by him and about him, I've grown close to him and grown close to an understanding of what his life was like, what his life must have looked like and sounded like and felt like. And I've had the opportunity to, of course, interact with him. He died in 1963. He died the day before the March on Washington, and I was born in 1957. And so I actually went to his 90th birthday party in New York City, and he spoke to me. Literally said the most distinguished person in the room is my great grandson, that kind of thing. And so the speech was something that he wrote down, and then there were reporters there who reported on it, and he put it into his posthumously published autobiography that was published in 1968. And so I have right in front of me on my bookshelf a copy that my wife gave me of his speech to me, right? And so I'm a 3-month-old, and here is a 90-year-old W.E.B. Du Bois. If you can just imagine in a room, a Roosevelt Hotel in New York City, and he's talking to me. I'm in my mother's arms or in my father's arms. We're both there, and he's talking to this little 3-month-old. And you said it, potentially one of the, if not the greatest African-American intellectual of the century, and perhaps of all history, right? He is this huge figure. And he's talking to me. She's talking to this little boy. And so over the years, I've had to come to grips with that. I've had to come to an understanding in my own mind and in my own intellect and in my own life as to why did he do that, number one? And then number two, what was he trying to tell me? What was the message that he was trying to get across to me? And how do I live that? Does it matter to me? Is it something I care about? Is it something that I can live, or is something that I should live? Or is it something I should just ignore and say, Grandpa was crazy. Forget about that. How do you say that to W.E.B. Du Bois? You can't say that about W.E.B. Du Bois. You can't go, well, yeah, Grandpa was crazy. No, that doesn't work. That's not how the universe functions, right? And so I go through and I try to, dissect, if you will, some of the things that he said. I try to understand and grapple with some of the things that he was bringing to the table when he said these things at 90 years old. Because at 90, Grandpa has gone through all of this stuff. If you look back across his life, he has gone through, he's published all these books, he started all of these organizations, he's traveled to all of these countries, he's spoken to all these people, he's written to all, he's been thrown in jail, he's been pulled out of jail, he's made friends with Albert Einstein, he's done all of these things. So it's impossible to sit back and say, oh yeah, Grandpa was crazy. You can't do that. I can't do that. And so I'm forced in my life to understand, or try to understand, what was my grandfather trying to say to me. And then I also have to put this into a context of the photographs that I have with him. And one of my favorite photographs of me as a child is a photograph of me with my great-grandfather. And it's on the day that he's leaving to go to Ghana. So I'm standing there. There's a woman in the middle of the picture who is Alice Crawford, who is a cousin, and then my grandfather. And if you look carefully at the picture, I'm looking at the camera, Alice is looking at the camera, but Grandpa is looking at me. And I'm standing there, I'm clearly standing, and he's clearly sitting, and my hand is on his hand. When you think about the psychology of children, and you imagine this is Idlewild Field, this is JFK Airport. He's this famous person who's leaving to go to Ghana, probably never to return. The picture doesn't show the chaos that must be going on around him, right? Or the chaos that must be going on around us. But the chaos is reflected in this little boy with his hand on his great-grandfather's hand. What children do when they don't feel safe is they go to somebody they feel safe with and they touch them. And they make that contact to say, okay, I'm safe now, I'm safe with him, so I must be safe, right? And you can then look in Grandpa's eyes as he's looking at me, and the connection is just obvious. It's just obvious in the picture, the connection that the two of us had. And so I have to put all of what I say in that context as well. So it's not, I don't have just an intellectual relationship with my great-grandfather, because we didn't share very many years, so we didn't have a chance to talk. So my intellectual relationship with him is through what he's written. It's through what he's done. It's through who he is. But my emotional connection to my great-grandfather is through this picture and my understanding by this picture of our relationship. And then my mother's relationship with him and the letters that they shared and the letters that he sent to her for me, all kinds of little pieces of that emotional side of who is W.E.B. Du Bois to me, which is your question, right? The complexity of it is this. I'm dealing with W.E.B. Du Bois, the figure, the person, the man, the accomplishments. But I'm dealing with my grandfather. And that's the difference between me and everybody else. The difference between what my relationship is and how I feel about him and how everyone else on the planet, aside from my younger brother and my older sister, I have a complete unique relationship with it. And even in terms of those two, I have a completely unique relationship with him because Jeffrey was born after Grandpa left, after Grandpa died. And Nina, my older sister, because of the circumstances of her birth, was is unrecognized in Grandpa's life. So if you go back and you try to find the name Nina Irvin, you don't find it because of the circumstances of her birth and Grandpa's beliefs around those circumstances. And I'm not going to dig into the details of that. I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. But the point being, along comes Arthur. Along comes this boy child after Grandpa has lost Burkhart. He's had a daughter. His daughter has had a daughter. And then his granddaughter has me. And remember the mindset of the man who was born in 1868 in a small town in southwestern Massachusetts, but grew up in a Victorian type age in a very eclectic space out at the University of Berlin, at Harvard, and at Fisk, and all of these places, but still has a fairly relatively narrow perspective about family, right? So here comes this boy, and he absolutely dotes on me. I am absolutely Burkhart in some ways reincarnated, the first boy child in the family in generations. And so I have that perspective on him to me to deal with, to manage, to think about. So when you ask the question, and when I get asked this question by folks who just sort of ask the question because it's an obvious question to ask, I answer less completely and less distinctly about what it means to be a part of a Black family like mine, like Du Bois. That family has this unique thing going on with the past and to the point of what you're doing, Tim, with the future. You can look at the work that Grandpa has done and say, and not just in the Comet, but in, Souls of Black Folk, in Philadelphia Negro, in, Suppression of the African Slave Trade, in Black Reconstruction, in any of the books that he's written that cut across time. They cut across time in ways that are what make Du Bois, right? they are what make him such a fascinating and fantastic feature in our African history. He commands the kind of attention because anyone who can write a book and 120 plus years later, people are still reading it, talking about it, learning from it. Right? Souls of Black Folk is eternal in African American history and culture because he did such an amazing job of explaining what was going on in that crucible around the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century. And the way he described it is so timeless that we as African American people still see ourselves in a statement about double consciousness, right? We still understand ourselves in terms of that Negro who is American and a Negro at the same time. And we understand that that two-ness has multiplied. We're not just two anymore. We're three, we're five, we're 17. We're wearing so many hats that we forget what hat we have on sometimes, right? That's the culture and the world that we live in. So when you ask me about my relationship to my great-grandfather, because he was so complex, and he, through my mother, through his granddaughter, passed that complexity on to me, my relationship with him is, at a lot of levels, a very complicated and unusual relationship. I can say this in an attempt, probably a vain attempt, to simplify all of what I've just said over the last 10 minutes. I have an amazing love, intellectual relationship with a man that I had only a handful of years to get to come to know, who held me, who walked with me, who talked with me, who wrote to me, and who I feel not just the intellectual greatness coming from, but his willingness to say to a young boy, his young great-grandson, let me tell you a little bit about the path that you're getting ready to embark upon. What does that mean to me? It means to me that he loved me. It means to me that he had knowledge and wisdom that he wanted to share with me. I think that somehow he knew, by watching his daughter and watching his granddaughter, that his genes were passing on certain characteristics, right? Leadership characteristics, a little bit of stubbornness, leadership characteristics and a little bit more stubbornness, right? And he understood through his experiences as a Black man in America what that would mean for me, what that would mean for my going forward in the world. And so I look back on what he said, and I think to myself, I want to do these kinds of things in my life and with my life because he said, it's okay. You can do that. It's going to be all right. It's going to be fine to be that. And I'm not afraid. I think a lot of people go through their lives afraid of trying some things and trying new things or trying to be this or trying to be that. People say, oh, Arthur, you always speak truth to power. Well, of course, because I've had in my mind conversations with W.E.B. Du Bois. If I can speak truth to him, who are you? I don't have a problem talking to you because I can talk to him. So I don't know if that answers your question completely, Julian, or if I just rambled around somewhere, but that's my very complicated relationship with an amazing man, with my grandfather.
No, I think that's beautiful, and it really speaks to the way that you've sort of embraced the legacy. I think a lot of people would have tremendous weight thinking about this great ancestor they have and how they live up to it. And I think you really embrace the potentiality of that and what he stood for, which is a complex legacy and made it a part of who you are. And I really appreciate that. You alluded to this
with the weight for a while. I had a hard time with the weight that you're talking about. For a long time, I thought that being Du Bois's great-grandson was an albatross that was hanging around my neck, literally. That I had so much to live up to in trying to live up to being that. That was the way my mother perceived it. You have a lot to live up to. You're W.E.B. Du Bois's great-grandson. Stand up straight. Listen, learn, do. That's the legacy that my mom passed on to me. But as I became my own person, I stepped out of her shadow and his shadow to become a person confident in doing what I wanted to do and making the mark that I wanted to make on the world, which is a mark that is reflective of him, but is not his.
I love that. And this next question is really for both of you because I think it's an important question to ask. You know, the boys produce so much work, and I teach a class about Afrofuturism, and we always read the comment, and I'm always struck by, you know, as a prepare to sort of talk about that, the nuances of the way that the boys thought about things and the sort of scope and depth of this work. And so, for you, Arthur, and for you, Tim, when did you first become familiar with the comment? What were those circumstances? Because of course, that's an important, and in some ways, this is a very important work for Afrofuturism, very important work in the history of science fiction, you know, as a literary genre, but also a work that, in relation to all the other work, which is Titanic in many ways, is easy to miss. So for you, Arthur, when did you first sort of come familiar with the comment? How did that, in the context of like coming to grips with the work and coming to understand this sort of relationship with your ancestor, you know, how did that happen?
Both consciously and subconsciously. And what I mean by that is I ran across the comet kind of like I ran across the princess stories that he tells and some of the poetry that he had written, because some of the things that I mentioned earlier, the books that he's written, the Crisis magazine that he edited, were so large in history, and there was so much to read, and I was busy trying to do other things. The comet and some of that stuff sort of slipped off of my radar screen, right? The Mansart stories, right? So just to show you how crazy in some ways this subconscious exercise was for me, I did not understand that the last book in that series was dedicated to me. I didn't know that until a Du Bois scholar who I was doing a talk for remotely in Houston held the book up to the screen and said, "Did you know?" And I'm like, "No, I didn't know that." Right? That's
Wow.
how this some of the less famous pieces of work that he's done, the less influential pieces of work that he's done, sort of slipped off of my screen. So that's the subconscious part. I saw the comment. I realized somebody said it's science fiction. I was in love with science fiction. All of the names that you mentioned earlier was, you know, Samuel R. Delany, and understanding that these were Black authors writing in a field that I absolutely loved. I mean, I loved Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein and all the hard science fiction writers. To know that there were Black science fiction writers out there was like, okay, I'm reading this. And then to find out Grandpa had this little story, I'm like, oh, cool. And and so it was there consciously at that level. But then honestly, it's kind of slid off. It slid off the screen. And primarily because I had so many other science fiction heroes, and I had the chance to meet some of them. I met Arthur C. Clarke. I met Isaac Asimov. I had a chance to talk with Isaac Asimov face to face and have actually real time with him. Um, did you know that Isaac Asimov was afraid of flying? Anyway, so you can edit that part out, Tim.
Oh no,
Anyway,
that's definitely staying in. That's definitely staying in. That's not going anywhere.
but so in that sense, the comet wasn't front and center for me. It wasn't something I talked about in any of my talks that I gave about Grandpa, because I was busy talking about things that I thought people would gravitate towards, that would influence their perspectives a little bit more, or that they wanted me to talk about. So consciously and subconsciously, it had, I think, a lot of influence in my life without actually being that thing that was front and center.
Yeah. So
Tim?
for myself, wow, that was Uh, uh, you know, there was a wait that didn't exist 15 minutes ago. So thanks a lot, Arthur. I appreciate it, man. Oh, wow. Okay. So, which is okay. Which is okay because Julian, you know me. You know me.
Yeah.
We've had this conversation numerous times. Uh, I knew of the Comet years ago, but it was not something I actively sought out, right? Because I was started out in comics in the late 80s, you know, went through my whole thing of the indie thing, and then I became, you know, got into the mainstream comic book industry doing work for Marvel and things like that until the industry basically imploded in the late 90s. Like many cartoonists at that time, I had to make a decision. Okay, how are you going to make your living? Right. So I left comics behind. I went into animation and game design and lots of teaching while I was raising my kids. So I was aware because particularly the turn of the century is when Dark Matter, Cherie Renee Thomas's book, what really came into being, where the comet was when I first became aware of it.
Yeah.
But you know, well, I'm not doing comics anymore. I'm doing animation.
Yeah.
So, you know, but when I came back to comics 12, 13 years later, first it was about just trying to get in. And this is something I'm so happy we're having this conversation again. Thank you both for doing this, is because I have always had an interest in doing what I call forerunner projects, what Julian refers to as precursor projects, right? And the first project that I did coming back into comics, my return after 12, 13 years out of the game, was adapting Alex Simmons' book, Blackjack. Because Blackjack was this action adventure character. It was low-hanging fruit, right? It was low-hanging fruit in the sense that I knew him. We knew each other, right? We both taught at the Children's Arts Carnival, which is ironically where the exhibit is happening now, the Comet Cometh exhibits. And I knew I could approach him and I asked, hey, look, I'd like to adapt your stories. And I ended up doing There Came a Dark Hunter, that graphic novel. Because Blackjack, to me, in terms of the lexicon of Alex, is a little bit older. Alex is in his early 70s now. So he's one of our distinguished elders in terms of Black comic, the writing components of it. A fantastic writer, along with his partner, Chris Ryan. And what he does, this Blackjack character is based in that kind of turn of the century action adventure starting in the early, 1900s, 1920s, and then culminating in 1930s. So it's of that period that the comet is about. And I have my project, Maddie's Rocket, which is based in that period. So I've always had an affinity for that period, that kind of post-slavery, post-Reconstruction Jim Crow period, and how Black people move through that period, how they move. That's fascinating to me. So when I got back into comics, I started with Blackjack. I then did my own things, and I became really aware that there was a growing interest in the comic around 2015, 2016. Because I was back in comics and I'm looking for projects to do, right? Some started, some stopped. But in 2021, after I finished Infinitum, my book that came out through HarperCollins, and then I released Maddie's Rocket, I actually was with my wife, who's a playwright, Melanie Maria Goudreau, and she did a one-woman show in Massachusetts. And on the way home, we stopped by the birthplace of your grandfather, your great-grandfather. And of course, there's not much left of the property there, right? But I knew I will do the comic. I just knew it. I'm going to do the comic, right? And I know I'll try my best to be more concise because I don't want to go on too long with answering this question. But basically, I knew I was going to do it. Or I knew I wanted to do it. Had a few distractions, Julian, which you know about, I won't go into. But ultimately what ended up happening was when I decided, okay, I'm going to do the Comet, the beauty of it is all of the complexities I had with doing other projects, doing the Comet and getting the movement on the Comet was like air. It was like water. It just flew. It flowed very easily. And it was incredible. It was incredible because I spoke with scholars in Massachusetts. I spoke with scholars / lawyers in North Carolina, and I received all these mixed information about whether or not I could do the Comet. And once I knew it was public domain, right? And I said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do it because it's public domain. But I knew in my heart, I did not want to proceed down this path without some sort of blessing. And I tried to find some of the other relatives. Some of that stuff I won't go into was kind of interesting because I decided, I don't know if I want to deal with that, right? But I went on LinkedIn and I found, well, who's this Arthur McFarlane, the second guy? Let me look at him, right? And I sent the LinkedIn out. A few days, didn't reply. I figured, oh, well, he's probably not interested. And next thing you know, I went to San Diego Comic-Con in 2023. And just so happened, Arthur, who lives in Hawaii, was in California at the same time. So we connected. And that is how I received the blessing to do the Comet. I will say this last thing, and then you can get on to your other question there. It is fairly apparent to me, Arthur, that your grandfather loved you very, very much. That is clear. And as a result, when I say the weight, I try to bring it with all my projects, even when it's a detriment to my health, which is why we were talking before this conversation about health and using the iWatch to do that. I got to engage in all that. And believe it or not, this guy's an expert at it. So it was amazing. It's just every day there's some thread that I go, oh, I didn't even see that. And it was something that happened. So I tried to do big books, big books. I'm not going to have the quantity of books that other cartoonists have, but I'm looking for quality and completion. And I'm looking for faith, and I'm looking for diligence to the material. And I'm looking to innovate within the medium to tell your great-grandfather's story. I think it's very important. I think it's important to, hopefully, God willing, I can do something that your family will appreciate, and something that the lexicon and the field of Afrofuturism will appreciate, right? I hope that we still got a ways to go, and we'll go more into what the show is. I'm hoping that what I'm doing is taking the efforts that Cherie did, she created, and I'm hoping in my own way, I'm hoping to extend that even further. Because I would not be doing this without Cherie. Wouldn't be doing this without anyone here on this conversation now. So that is what it's about for me. And ultimately, I need this one for me. I'm just going to say it. I need this one for me. I need this one for me. Every book has its place, but this one, the honor of doing this book with this giant, for this giant, I'm hoping I'm his eyes. That's what I'm hoping to be able to do.
I want to say that comes through. That has come through in every single conversation that we have had, in every single email, in every single picture that I've seen that you've done of this work. I remember the first set of of pictures that you sent me, and I've told my friends, I was stunned. I was amazed at the level of work, the quality of work, the commitment that you've made to making this come to life. But I also want to mention a couple of things. As you were talking, I took a couple of notes. You were talking about how sort of my perception was some of the negativism that had come out of the 1920s, the post-Reconstruction period. There was just a lot of turmoil going on there. The period just prior to the 1920s with the 1919 summer, Red Summer. You had lynching. The reason the NAACP and the Urban League were created was because of lynching going on in the country. But the one thing that you didn't talk about that I think at least for me, has a huge impact on what you've done is the Harlem Renaissance. And so when you talk about Nora Zeal Hurston and you talk about County Cullen and you talk about Langston Hughes, Langston Hughes was one of my heroes because I thought one of these days I was going to be a poet, and because my junior high school English teacher exposed me to Langston Hughes, and I just fell in love with the work that he'd done. And so that 1920s period was, I started just kind of digging around in it, and only to find out that my grandmother had gotten married. One of the biggest weddings of the Harlem Renaissance period in Harlem was my grandmother's wedding. And so, it's just this period of incredible creativity on all kinds of levels, on dance, on poetry, on books, on, just music, all of the creativity that kind of came out of that explosion for Black people. And so when you talk about the Comet being sort of a part of that, I look into it and I look with that eye of the grandson, the great grandson, and I go, Grandpa, what were you doing? What were you thinking about with that? And I look back and I think about his editorship of The Crisis and all of the poetry by Claude McKay and by Langston Hughes and County Cullen and all the work by Nora Zeal Hurston and everything, all of these writers that he published, some of them for the first time because he was the editor and he wanted that. And then he writes, about Bam, and he writes the Comet, and he writes this book, this children's book, and then he goes into music and into ballet and to all these places, and he puts his little fingerprints on, and he goes off into something else. And it's one of the things that amazes me about Grandpa, because he just was so prolific in that way and so interesting and so influential in those ways. And the other thing, and I'll just mention quickly, is something that my wife discovered. His wife, Nina's parents, were a mixed couple. They were a mixed couple. And so you remember Nina is just a couple of years younger, 3 years younger than Grandpa. So her parents were parents in that time period during the Civil War, 1860s, and they were in, I believe it was Iowa.
Wow.
If I'm not getting my history too confused. And so when you look at the Comet and you go, okay, where's some of the influence coming from for writing this story? I wonder what relationship he had with Nina's parents, what the fact that they were an interracial couple, the fact that he knew he had white ancestors in his line, the Burgharts did, and how did that all bubble to the surface?
Well, let me speak to that. And I have become convinced. I'm not a historian, but I have become convinced that not only as I've done, because I'm forced to break his words down into sequential images. When you're doing that, you're basically getting a download of what this guy was thinking, because it's not just words, they're words now decoded into images. See what I'm saying? So it's not just reading, it's reading and writing and creating a story with it. So there are things he has in the story that are only implied.
Right.
This is my theory. W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the creators of post-apocalyptic speculative fiction. I'm convinced of it. I'm convinced of it. Because I'm not saying he created horror. I'm not going to go that far. But I'm saying post-apocalyptic fiction, where you have, mass death and, the last survivors. I'm not aware of many stories, and it would, if the audience who's listening would like to comment on that. I believe that your great-grandfather was a bad man in way more ways. Like when you're saying he's tinkering in a medium with children's books and science fiction, because he was an innovator in so many forms, one could debate whether it was innovative, whether it was he did it on purpose, it was, inadvertently. He might have stumbled on creating a new genre. That's what I'm saying.
So you should someday have a conversation with I want to say Morris Alden. I'm not. I don't know that I have his name right, and my memory is a little shaky. He wrote a book called The Scholar Denied.
Alden Morris. Yeah,
Alden Morris.
Morris.
Thank you. I just had it backwards. Okay. Oh, good. Thank you. He wrote this book, and when he first came to me and asked me what I thought about this concept that he had, I was like, of course, that's right. Of course, that makes sense. And so then he writes the book and does all of this research. And if you go and read the book, he has lots of research to show that Grandpa created or brought to the United States this whole idea that we call sociology or scientific sociology, and that he had the first department of scientific sociology at Atlanta University, way before the University of Chicago folks even thought about that stuff, right? And so when you say what you say to me about creating this genre of post-apocalyptic fiction, my mind just goes nuts. Okay, I'm literally sitting here trying to hold myself down in a chair.
I go nuts, man.
No, I go in a good way, in a good way, because I love post-apocalyptic fiction. The Postman by David Brin. Oh my, I went straight off when I read that, and all of these post-apocalyptic science fiction stories that are out there, right? And I've always thought, well, Arthur, why are you so dark? What is this darkness in your personality that makes you amenable to reading and hearing and seeing? But then when you say that, and I think to myself, what was the apocalypse that he was really being influenced by? And if you can't see apocalypse in slavery, in the transatlantic slave trade, then you're just blind. Okay? Deaf, dumb, or stupid, right? Stoned or stupid. Because that was an apocalypse. That was a true apocalypse for Black people, for African people, for African American people, for African Caribbean people, for African, South American people, Brazilian, all of the folks who were brought to this continent. It was an apocalypse. You can't see it as anything else but that, right? And particularly in the form of the slavery that we had here in the United States, because the slavery we had here was unique, right? And it was elongated, and it was fought over in ways that slavery wasn't fought over in the rest of the world, right? And so when you say he created this genre, I'm going, there has to be something dark in you in order to bring that out into the world. And the darkness was this slavery, post-slavery experience that he wrote his dissertation about. How could you even write that dissertation and not have some darkness seep into your soul?
I have a question. I'm sorry, Julian. I'm gonna let you get to it. I apologize.
No.
We chopping it up, man. We chopping it up. Could it not have been darkness, but it was actually hope? He knew enough that if what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an act of God, is what he did within the pages. I'm going to create an act of God, but I'm going to do it by pointing towards the science field. He said he knew Einstein, right? He was a contemporary of H.G. Wells, right? So he said, I'm going to fabricate, right? I'm going to fabricate a story in which that element of race and gender has to be dealt with.
Right.
But I'm going to do it through science and colliding it with sociology. And I think that's brilliant.
He was more than a contemporary of H.G. Wells.
Oh, okay.
H.G. Wells was an anti-slavery, anti-lynching activist. He
Okay.
was H.G. Wells was at a couple of, if I'm not mistaken, he was at a couple of the conferences that Grandpa was responsible for bringing about the Pan-African Congresses. So, you know, historically, when we put ourselves back in that time, the first Pan-African Congress was 1900. So this is the first time people are getting together in Europe to talk about releasing the entire continent of Africa from colonization, right? And so
Right.
Grandpa had multiple Pan-African Congresses, and H.G. Wells was involved in those. So when you look at being contemporary, it's more than contemporary. I'm sure they had conversations, and I wonder too whether that was, yeah, mind blown, right? I wonder if some of those conversations could possibly be part of what
Yeah.
brings about the comet. Right. That's what I'm
Right.
saying. It's that when you start dealing with Grandpa, your mind gets blown constantly because of the people that he knew and the people that he was talking to. The Pan African Congresses brought Jomo Kenyatta to the table. They brought Kwame Nkrumah to the table. They brought H.G. Wells to the table. They brought Einstein was engaged in some of that stuff. They brought all of you know, all the African people that came to all of these people that came together, and they came together in 1900. They came together in 1919. They came, I think was it 1924? I know they skipped a while because of the war, and then they didn't get back together again until like 1945. So, but you can go back and you can look at Pan-African Congresses. They held them across, and I know the one in 1919 was in Paris because I have this picture that's in French. It's like, oh, okay, that was Paris. And so these people are coming together to have conversations ostensibly about the decolonization of Africa, but they're bringing their own intellectual histories and their own personal cultures to the table with them. And so I have no doubt that there was intermingling of a ton of ideas there. Now, whether or not, you know, H.G. Wells' influence over Grandpa caused him or prompted him to write about the comet, or whether I would have to defer to a Du Bois expert, which I am not, by the way. I am not a Du Bois scholar. I'm not a Du Bois expert. People like Phil Sineterre or you know, Alden Morris or the woman's name just went out of my head at University of Massachusetts at Amherst, who just put together a book on how Grandpa used data and data pictures to be a first and a leader in how we depict data.
Not Britt
She just
Russet.
put.
Britt
I'm
Russet?
sorry.
Britt Russet?
Nuh-uh.
Okay.
It's a woman who she is the head of the African American Studies Department at UMass Amherst.
Oh, okay.
She is also an archaeologist, and she is responsible for the archaeology work that has been going on at Grandpa's birth site. You mentioned earlier that there wasn't a lot left. Well,
Right.
she's been part of the people digging in the ground archaeologically to really depict what life was like for the Black Burkharts going backwards in time. So she's incredibly well versed in Grandpa's stuff. She and Phil came to do an interview with me back a number of years ago, back when I still lived in Colorado. And so, yeah, I mean, there are tons of people who know Grandpa better from that level. And because all of his, not all of his, but a bunch of his papers are at UMass Amherst. Whitney Battle Baptiste is the woman that I'm speaking of. Whitney Battle Baptiste put together the book on the data, and she's there at UMass Amherst, and so she has a lot of insight into what's there and the works that Grandpa. So if there's a letter somewhere out there between H.G. Wells
Wow.
and W.E.B. Du
Wow.
Bois or two, I wouldn't be at all surprised.
Wow.
And right, you know, who knows?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I
Speculative.
think, you know, one of the things that well, there's always these weird ways that these figures interact, especially in this period. So yeah, maybe that'll be one of the things that we'll revisit in some future conversations. But I do want to ask about the process of making the comet, making this adaptation and your interactions with each other, because you know, even from this conversation, I can see that your interactions must be enlightening and speculative in their nature and a celebration of potentiality around this story. And I'd love for Arthur you to talk a little bit about your experience in working with Tim, about your feelings about this adaptation and what you're hoping, I think, for the public to get from this great project.
Yeah, I think that I'm the kind of person who likes to say yes to new things. I like to explore new ways of thinking and new ways of looking at things and new ideas. And my mind is not linear. It's very nonlinear in its approach to stuff. And so when Tim, approached me, I was like, huh, I hadn't thought about the comet in years. And I was stunned by his pictures. And I'm like, yeah, this could be a new way to bring Grandpa to a new contemporary audience, which is always something that I'm trying to do. I'm always saying yes to people when they say, will you come and talk to this elementary school or to this high school or that college or this group or that group, because I don't want Du Bois's legacy to just sort of fade away. It's too influential. It's too phenomenal to just sort of fade off into some dark good night or whatever. And I know there are a lot of other people who feel the way I do. I talk often with Raylan Rabaka, who is another Du Bois scholar at a University of Colorado Boulder, um, about how do we keep Grandpa's name in front of people. And his way is just to keep writing another book about Grandpa. So it's like, dude, you do it. So there are a lot of people out there who feel the same way that I do. And I know that doing this work with Tim is just another avenue for that. Tim is an amazing artist as far as I'm concerned, and I'm, stunned by the work that he does. And to have him have a desire to do this work is fascinating and amazing as far as I'm concerned. So it was easy for me to say yes. But then he and I started talking. So, and you can see by this conversation as we play off of each other, going back and forth, we each spark in each other a different idea or a different thought or a different connection or a different way of seeing this work. And that's what I hope when you ask the question, what do I hope it does going forward? That's what I hope it does. I hope what it does when people look at it and when they read it and then they consider it and they look at their own lives and they look at what's going on in the world today, that they say, oh, here's this different way of looking at it. Here's this different way of looking at race relations, a different way of looking at the interactions that we have across cultures and across generations and across time. Because ultimately, when you go back and you read the advice that my great grandfather gave me when I was 3 months old, he says a lot of things. And one of the things he says is that there is very little difference between 100 years and 1,000 years. And so when we talk about Afrofuturism or we talk about science fiction, and we look back on H.G. Wells and when we think about submersibles, submarines that didn't exist when he talked about, or we think about spaceships that didn't exist when he wrote about them, and we talk about the influence that science fiction has on our reality in the directions that we go scientifically. Arthur C. Clarke and his work with transistors, Isaac Asimov and his chemistry and the work that he did in biology. You see how the reality of the science takes us in a direction and makes us think futuristically about what it is that we want to do and who it is that we want to be as a culture, as a race, as a group of people on a little small rock, third planet from the sun. You have to, as Tim said earlier, infuse that with this idea of race, with this idea of culture, with these ideas around difference and these ideas around diversity and equity and inclusion, which is some work that I do at Children's Hospital in Colorado. You've got to think about those things as we go forward into that future, and the Comet can help that. The Comet can make you take a different perspective on that. It can make you take a different idea about that. I love Ellison's Invisible Man. It made me think a lot about a lot of things. The same as Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles made me think a lot about our current situation, and particularly, we were reading that in a Cold War kind of space. There Will Come Soft Rains it smacked me upside the back of my head and made me really stop and go, what? Wait a minute, we could destroy ourselves with this technology. We could just be a shadow on a wall because somebody got pissed and pushed the wrong button. Yeah. Well, yeah. And then you start and you come to the current time period and you go, yeah, what the heck is Elon Musk doing over there? Okay,
Right.
Tesla's one thing, and reshaping our thinking about electric vehicles and the way we drive and how we drive and who drives us or doesn't drive us and all the rest is one part of it. But you have to go over and look at the SpaceX side and go, yeah, we do need to not be just on this rock,
But then
right?
that's counterproductive when you start taking into account Twitter.
Yep, that's
So,
true. That's
so
Don't you
true.
mean don't
It's
you mean
true.
X? Tim?
well,
Yes, he does.
we'll see how that works itself out. I will say this though. I will say this. And I hope the parties and names I bring up, I hope they will forgive me, but I just feel like it would be remiss. One of the things that has been great about dealing with Arthur, because one of the ways I work is I try to swing big. I miss often, but I try to swing big. And making contact with him and staying in consistent contact with him and send monthly updates, right? Monthly updates, right? From the beginning, right? What it does, it keeps me accountable. And I've had issues in my career with finishing, but that's not so much of an issue now. But my thing now is you're going to finish because of my age, you got to finish big, right? And so I have to give my thanks to Arthur for his constant motivation, always a positive word, to Henry Louis Gates Jr., who has been absolutely, I've been interacting with him and he's been, and forgive me, Dr. Gates, but I have to mention you. I have to mention your motivation. Indirectly, David Levering Lewis, who's on the email thread. He doesn't reply because I know he's doing what he does, but I hope that he's at least seeing what's being sent. And I also have to thank Zephany Smith Eisenstadt of the NAACP. Because what I'm trying my best to do, I don't know if I'm going to succeed. We'll go into the aesthetic and the practical position of how the show is being manufactured. But what I'm hoping I am creating is a document that can extend the paths of Du Bois in all of those multiple areas. In the aspect of with Arthur personally, I'm hoping that I can do something that Arthur can feel proud of and said, okay, that is a faithful yet entertaining interpretation of what Grandpa did. And hopefully the people at Harvard will see, okay, yes, this is our guy. And yeah, and the NAACP, he co-founded the NAACP. I want them to understand that I'm doing something that is just as much for the organization. And for Afrofuturism, which of course Julian and I are part of that, the contemporary movement of that. So it's just about trying to produce something that adds to the lexicon, hopefully in a positive way.
Yeah,
Well, I think
there's a lot of space to influence out there too.
well, I want to bring our conversation to a conclusion with a question about art, actually. One of the things that consideration of W.E.B. Du Bois's work really calls attention to is his commitment to thinking about art as an important tool for the liberation, uplift, transformation of the Black experience, right? Any of those words you want to use. You can see it in the sort of fictive work that he created. You can see it in the support of art and the centrality of art and his editorialship of The Crisis, his essays on the importance of Negro art, right? This is, in some ways, amplifier of many of his ideas, the graphic adaptation of the comet. As a scholar of comics, I think of it as the most democratic of all art forms, accessible to so many people. And yeah, this is an adaptation of an incredibly important work from an incredibly important intellectual and scholar. So as you think about this project in the scope of that art and transformation matrix that was so important to the boys, what do you hope for the in the world, this graphic adaptation in the world? What are you hoping for with this project when it's out and available to people? Arthur, what do you think?
It's funny that you asked that question in that way, because a lot of people often ask me, well, what would your great grandfather think about this? You know, but you asked me what would I think about this? Where do I want this to go? And I want it to go somewhere where I think he would want it to go, which is to say, here is a different cross-hatched medium that will get it to a different and new audience, get it to a modern audience, get it to a contemporary audience, get it to a future audience, right? You know, the hope is that in 5 years or 10 years, someone picks it up and goes, wow, this is not just aesthetically beautiful. I can see the beauty in it, but the message is hammering home to me, right? So when you ask me what I hope, it's that some young person, you know, down the road, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, who knows, down the road says, this is influential to me, to my thinking, to my approach, to who I am, to the way I talk to my friends, to the the next date that I go out on. I don't know. Who knows what kind of level that might take, but to just be able to be there and be influential in how those folks are thinking and what they're saying to one another and how they're impacted. And just to continue to carry that legacy of Du Bois forward.
Yeah. Should I say, yeah, wow. You know, you should have let me go before Arthur, man. You should have let me go before him. I got to try to follow up with something that'll hopefully have some weight. But all joking aside, uh, in a micro sense, what an honor and a privilege. I'm from Clarksdale, Mississippi, and I thought my career was over 15 years ago. And I find myself in the middle of this present Afrofuturist moment. The Black speculative arts movement, all of us have some either in it or adjacent or whatever. And I find that it is so miraculous to me that this thing that I've been doing since I was 12 years old, that I'm the guy who's doing it. And so on one sense, it's a tremendous sense of pride. On the other hand, which I mean, you know, my colleague Walter Grayson would go crazy with the graphic history of hip hop. You know, it's that responsibility to get it right. It's the responsibility to get it right. Because yes, we want to meet our deadlines, we want to make sure we can deliver to market. These are all very, very important things. But more important, because no one cares about what inside baseball is going on when you're delivering a book. They only care about the book. 6 years from now, as you mentioned, Arthur, 10 years from now, they're going to want to know, is this book something worth reading? Now, I don't know if it will be, but it's my job to try to move it. So in that context, that's a personal, professional goal for me. On a macro level, and it goes, you know, there and then there, right? The first thing is I'm hoping to tell a fascinatingly innovative story for its time, to use a contemporary medium to move that narrative out into the general public. But to move the medium, to play with color or lack thereof color, right? Things that Du Bois only implied in the book. that I have the power to be able to put in to hopefully add detail, greeblies, if you will, implied detail. And then the larger point is, in terms of my bibliography, is to do books that can hopefully move the world. I know that's a lofty goal, but why not? And I've been so grateful for my life and the things that have happened to me over the last 3 years, even when it didn't feel good, because it got me to this point. And I want to do something that the community of Afrofuturists will feel proud of. The community of academics and scholars will feel proud of. That our agencies and organizations in the Black community, both domestically and abroad, can feel proud of. You know, and I hope to travel the world with this. That is what I hope.
That's possible, because I can tell you that I have traveled the world with my story about Grandpa. Exactly. And this is just another chapter in that story. I mean, I know tons of folks all around the planet who I can send a link to and say, check this out and let me know what you think, and they will pick it up and they will let you know what they think. And some of them, are older. They're my age and a little older, and they may look at it and not take it very seriously or not see it very seriously. But quite honestly, as I've been talking to my friends, I say to them, I'm not the audience, really. It's not aimed really at me. It's aimed at a group of people that are younger than I am, in terms of they're the ones who are looking at this kind of work, at this kind of art, and they are influenced by it. And to have them be influenced in this way and in this direction is what is so powerful to me. I truly believe that there's a lot of folks out there that will see the power in it.
Based upon what you said, and as I become more and more convinced, I said it in the last interview, your great-grandfather had an innate sense of pop culture. He did. And he knew how to use those genres to move his message forward. And that's a monster. That dude was I'm saying that as opposed to the other M word. That's incredible for the time when he was doing that. George Romero would come along with that. What, 40 years later? You know what I'm saying? With Night of the Living Dead, this guy had done that 40 years prior. Only thing he didn't have in it was zombies. No, I'm serious. I'm dead serious. He understood it.
No pun intended. Dead serious. No pun intended. Dead serious.
Exactly. So, Robert Kirkman, George Romero, all of them owe a debt, and now I consider myself part of that crew. We all owe a debt to Du Bois.
Well, he was a very bad man in a lot of different ways, and a very dangerous Negro in a lot of different ways, and all of those were good things for what we needed. We as a culture, we as a race needed. So I want to take you back for a moment to something that you said earlier in response to something I said, which is he did come at this work, at all of his work, with a sense of hope. He did believe that we could excel, that we could rise above, that we could rise beyond, that we could go through, we could go under, we could go around these barriers that were in our way. The veil was something that he created to explain to us that it exists, not to make us believe that we could not get past it, that we couldn't see past it, that we couldn't. And I think he created it as opposed to a brick wall, right? Because there is something to be said about the ephemeral nature of a veil. There is something to be said about the fragility of that. And there's something to be said about the way that it obfuscates the rest of our existence, the rest of our world. It makes us see the world in a different way. But at the same time, where is my machete? because I can cut through a veil in a heartbeat, right?
When it comes to the comet, he was an entertainer. He was telling an entertaining story. He was.
Exactly.
So that's your machete right there.
That's right. I think it is all in his hands to give us an explanation of what we're experiencing, but at the same time give us the tools by which to fight against that, to move forward and to move beyond. I think you were absolutely right. He was trying to tell us something hopeful. At the very same time, he's explaining something that's very dark. There's no way to go through and write suppression of the African slave trade and have the same man write something like the Comet, or write something like Black Reconstruction, or write something like the Philadelphia Negro. He tried everything. That's one of the true things that amazes me of my great-grandfather was he tried all of these tools. He pulled all of these levers. He wrote all of these different things. He was, if you want to try to say, this is who Barack Obama is, the first thing you're going to say, he's the president, he was a former president of the United States. And that stands out over all of the rest of the man that Barack Obama is, right? You can't do that with Du Bois. He was a sociologist, he was a propagandist, he was an editor, he was a writer, he was a scientist, he created, he did, and any of them is equally as important and weighty in delivering the message that he was trying to deliver to Black people and white people, because he tried to talk to all of us.
Which means Du Bois was an Afrofuturist.
Precisely.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing I think that will come through in this project, because it is something I think many Afrofuturists understand. Du Bois was someone who wrestled with the tools necessary to liberate people into the future where they are healthier, safer, better. And he used every tool, as you say, to achieve that. So I think it's great to end on that point, and to thank you, Arthur, for spending the time. Thank you, Tim, for this great work. And I appreciate the opportunity to be in a room as you talked about this and to share your insights with the audience. The comet cometh, and it cometh now at the hands and in the minds and in the heart of Tim Fielder. Will be debuting at the Children's Art Carnival in Harlem, a historic space that has done much in terms of art and culture. And so it's very fitting for them to be the place where Tim's going to be bringing this work out. It's not just going to all drop at once. He's going to be doing it in phases. So you can return over and over again to see more of the story unfold. If you are interested in W.E.B. Du Bois's original story, you can find it online and through Project Gutenberg. I often have my students read it there. If you want to know more about Du Bois's really foundational work, Alden Morris's The Scholar Denied is the quintessential story of him as a leading figure in the definition of sociology. I was honored to have the opportunity to be at the Brown University Sociology Department when they enshrined Du Bois as one of the founders of sociology, giving him his rightful place as one of the founding figures in the sociological sciences in the United States. That is one of many, many things that Du Bois did. And for those of you who are interested, there is a body of work for you beyond just simply the souls of Black folk, beyond just simply his speculative work. It's his city studies at Clark Atlanta. It's his work with a number of scholars as a mentor, his work in the Pan-African movement, his work as the editor of The Crisis. He has so much work that we still continue to study to this day. So perhaps this project will remind people of the depths that they can go to learn more from W. Du Bois. And that too is a good thing.
Let me add one thing that I have not told Arthur. It was mentioned in the first interview, but I have not. So Arthur, we have a book deal for the Comet.
Really?
Yes. Can't go into who it is because they have to make their announcement, but we are in discussions with a major publisher, contemporary publisher for the Comet, the graphic novel adaptation. So we're gonna need you to get yourself ready to start writing the introduction, man, because you know I'm coming at you, right? But yes,
congratulations.
we have a deal. Yes.
Congratulations. He buries the lead, man.
Oh
What is
man,
up with that?
it hits you right in the head with it, right there. Very dramatic, right? Very dramatic, right? It works.
Right. Now
Congratulations, man.
Thank you.
That is special. That is special,
And it's
man.
my honor to be the one to have told you. I'm grateful for that.
Wow, that is special. Well, we will, given that that's the case, we will have to, at some point, meet in person, get the book, the company to get us together to be on the same stage at the same time or something, or a book signing or whatever, just to make sure that people understand how serious we are, because congratulations, man. That is amazing.
Thank you.
That is amazing.
I wouldn't have done it without your go ahead, sir. Thank you.
Well, I played a very small part in just being encouraging. That's all I did. So, and happy to do it. Happy to do it. It's amazing work, man. I really am struck by how much it really had an impact on me, just looking at it and visualizing it, even without reading the story. Just looking at the visualizations is just amazing. So I look forward to seeing it in a book. That's going to be great.
Yeah, awesome. Congratulations, and thank you both.
My pleasure. You, Julian. It was a pleasure to spend some time with you, Tim, as always. So we will do some more.